Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Natalie Gochner, and I direct the Gardner Policy Institute. We're all excited today because one of our colleagues, Max Backlund, has had a new baby this morning. So we give our best wishes to his wife and to Max's family. I want to welcome everyone to our virtual Newsmaker breakfast. We appreciate you all being here. I have a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. We've disabled our screen share and audio features for all participants except our panelists, but you will be able to submit questions in the chat box. And we're going to save a lot of time for that, so we invite you to do that. Our communications director, Nick Thuriot, thanks Nick for all you're doing, will help facilitate your questions. Our topic today is a very important one. We're going to focus on our capital county, our largest county, Salt Lake County, and the historic apartment boom that is occurring. The county's housing shortage and high home prices have led to what our author in the report calls the tightest apartment market in its recent history. In 2021, the vacancy rate dropped below 2%, and rental rates increased by double digits. Buildings and developers have responded with a record number of rental units, both under construction and proposed. And today we're joined by experts and leaders in the industry who will discuss these trends and what this new level of construction means to the county's rental market. Before we go to our panel discussion, I'd like to ask Jim Wood, who is our Ivory Boyer Senior Fellow here at the Gardner Institute, to walk us through the trends. Jim is incredibly knowledgeable and has authored a report called Salt Lake County's Historic Apartment Boom, Past, Present, and Future. So Jim, I'm going to turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. It's great to be with you today, people in the industry, on this really important topic. We've published a fair amount and discussed the housing shortage. What we're seeing now really is a response to that shortage by developers in the apartment market. We are really it is a historic boom. I've followed the market for a long time, and this last few years has really been really very unique, unusual, and in a lot of ways difficult really to analyze and gauge, but we're in new territory. Let me just start by giving some context. First of all, the Salt Lake County apartment market has almost 150,000 renter units. Of those, almost all are now occupied. Probably 147. We have around, I would guess, 3,000 units that are vacant, given some recent surveys. Nick, if we go to the first slide, we'll just see what happened in Salt Lake County in terms of building permits for apartment units in 2021. You can see we are at almost 6,700 permits issued for apartment units, more than half of all residential permits in Salt Lake County. And that's quite unusual. And there are a number of factors behind that. We'll probably discuss today this growing preference and also growing need for rental living. As Natalie said, it's this last year, we've seen 2021 really from the survey work, the tightest rental market really in our history, at least as far back as we have data. I work with Cushman Wakefield on a survey that I've done 20 years for them. And this past year, in the summer, I did the annual survey, and there was really virtually no vacancy. Usually what when I survey a project, I ask them how many units, for example, if I came in today to rent a studio unit, how many units do you have that are available for immediate occupancy? And in many cases, and in the first time this has happened, it's pretty much you got to get approved, come in, get approved, fill out the forms, and then we will have something maybe in 30 days or 60 days, depending. So extremely tight, and I've got to give a presentation tonight to the Salt Lake Planning Commission, Salt Lake City Planning Commission, and I did survey about 4,000 units downtown. Some of those are dance projects, and of 4,000 units, there were 42 vacancies, and just really exceptionally tight. But what we see happening, I think, as I mentioned, we've had a lot, it's encouraged, those market conditions have encouraged development as well as buyers. And Mark will talk about some of the buyers for those products, I hope, and Dan will talk about development. But if we go on the next slide, Nick. This is a tally for Salt Lake County, and then Salt Lake City broken out. Right now under construction in Salt Lake County, we have about 12,000, a little over 12,000 units under construction. And a good share of those you can see are in Salt Lake City. I did visit many sites over the weekend, and in fact, there are about 8,000 units under construction in Salt Lake City. And the proposed units, you can see down below, a total of almost 10,000 proposed units. Now I got to make a comment on these data. We don't have a real good centralized source for proposed units. That's really has to be cobbled together from planning offices and from people like Mark and Dan who are in the market. So those numbers are really difficult. There's a lot, there's probably more than this proposed. What I'm looking at really is over the next 3 years, what will come on the market. So anyway, that gives a little background of where we are. Very tight market, encouraged a lot of development. We're at record levels of development, and also record levels of proposed projects. And it's really a statewide boom. Last year we had 14,000 permits for apartment units. The previous high, all-time high, was in 2020, and it was about 9,600. So we just blasted through that record, and 14,000. So it is a historic boom, and I'll turn back to Natalie, and she can proceed.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks for kind of outlining that. I want to stay with you for just a minute, Jim, and just share with our listeners that I read your research brief, and it is a fascinating read because of how unusual the times are in Salt Lake County's apartment market. And I wondered if you could just take a second and give us 2 or 3 highlights from the report, and then I'll bring our guests into the conversation.
Well, I think the highlight is the vacancy rate at less than 2%, the rental rates going up, and we're worried about affordability. The rental rates have gone up at double-digit rates, anywhere from 10, 12, and some surveys have higher than that. And what this means really for you look at the rental population, about a third of our occupied housing units in the rental market. For a lot of people, that's their only alternative. and it's an extremely tight market with prices increasing at the same time that I just looked at the numbers today. Salt Lake County single family homes, January and February compared to last year are up 27%. The median sales price, $585,000. That means you've got to have an income of about $115,000 to buy the median price home now in Lake County. That puts pressure on the rental market, and we need these rental units. But like markets, particularly where you have large projects, it's hard to time perfectly. And so we get surges in activity and building and development. But over time, even though we've got record numbers coming on, I do worry about the long-term future for the housing market and how important the rental market is to providing affordable housing for those who can't get into home ownership.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. That was a great summary. I want to bring in our guests, but I just want the listeners to know I was in a meeting with Jim yesterday. And, you know, when you talk about research methods, there's all sorts of things that we do at the Gardner Institute in analyzing data, collecting data, working through data sets. But Jim shared with me, Jim, how many units did you go visit this weekend as part of your research?
Well, for tonight's presentation, I was looking at Salt Lake City. So I visited 41 sites in Salt Lake City to make sure. I had a list. I wanted to make sure, are these projects really under construction? Because it was such a high number. And so I ran around and visited them. And in fact, there were a few that fell off, but by and large, 90% of them, 95% were under construction. So it was really, I do like field work, as I said, Natalie.
Great example of the research that happens at Gardner Institute. Let's bring Dan Lofgren and Mark Jensen into the conversation. Dan is the president of Cowboy Partners. Cowboy Partners specializes in multifamily mixed-use housing developments. I've been doing that for 20 plus years. Dan, welcome. Nice to see you this morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, and then Mark Jensen, who's an executive vice president with Colliers International. Mark is based in Salt Lake City, is an investment broker with over 13 years experience in the commercial real estate industry. Mark, I understand you've closed over $1 billion in commercial real estate transactions since 2004. We're really happy that you take time with us this morning.
My pleasure. I'm honored. Thank you so much. I don't have a beard like, you know, Dan and Jim, though.
Well, we could talk about that offline. Dan and Mark, I'll ask both of you, could you just briefly react to the findings of this study and what you've heard Jim present this morning, and then we'll go into more detail. Let's go to you first, Dan.
Well, there's, you know, our perceptions of the market align quite well with what Jim's just presented. We wouldn't take exception to any of it. It is a bit of a challenging market to really to really keep track of, really get your head around. You know, at one level, one will look at all this new production and think, man, that's awesome. That supply of product will bode well for affordability. The idea that there's this volume of product coming on the market, but in fact, just the opposite is happening. And there's trying to understand it. There's 3 or 4 key drivers of that, but the net result is that although we're producing product in record numbers, as Jim noted, the affordability of that product continues to erode. The affordability threshold, you know, historically, we've all thought about 30% of household income as the affordability threshold. I think that's way in the rearview mirror. We see, even among lifestyle renters, those who are renting by choice, not by virtue of need, even among lifestyle renters, larger and larger percentage of their household income being dedicated to housing as they reach up to move into some of the product, the extraordinary product that's being built right now. So fascinating market.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Mark, you're in the business of buying and selling rental properties. What makes this market different from your experience, and how do you react to what Jim has shared?
Yeah, there's certainly a number of different directions we can go. I think Dan hit the elephant in the room on the head, which is the fact that you can't build a Class C unit. So while we have all of these units that have been built and all these units that are being built, they certainly aren't going to affect our affordability. And for Utah to remain competitive moving forward, we really need to, we need to make some headway on the affordable housing front. When I spoke at the NAP symposium in 2017, I opened up with a joke that Dan might like, which is everybody gives all these awards to office and industrial builders because they build spec, but every apartment that Dan has ever built has been built spec, because until he gets C of O, no one can move in. But I closed that presentation with, between 2014 and January of 2017 at the NAP symposium, we had over 4,200 units that were purchased, renovated, and rents had increased on average $264. And so we were basically, between 2012 and 2018, had seen so much of our naturally affordable stock renovated. We just really started to erode our affordable housing, probably starting a decade ago, as we entered into the recovery. So certainly really fun to talk about the positives of all this new product coming online. There's some amazing, we've seen design improve, we've seen amenities improve, we've seen just some incredible projects, and we're moving towards a new Salt Lake City, which is incredible. But we do have, we will continue to have that affordable housing issue. I will touch base too a little bit on why we're seeing so much of the Class A. One of the metrics that a lot of buyers in the market look for is exactly what Dan was talking about, which is where are we on the affordability scale? And most of the Class A deals that we work on now, we are still in rent to income is still sub 20%. And so a lot of these developers are still seeing the ability to raise rents in these higher ranges, which is also why we're seeing success. And, Dan's obviously spearheading that. We're grateful for him and his pioneering project in downtown Salt Lake City. We're going to see a lot more high-end housing, which I think is going to change our market for sure.
And do you mind taking a second, just for those of us that don't work in this industry, do research in this area, and just break down how it works when you say Class A, when I hear Class C, whatever. Can you just give us the basics of that, Dan?
I might defer to Mark. That's that ABC typology is something much more meaningful in the investment world than it is in the development world. Mark, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, and obviously it's kind of arbitrary, and different people will drop different thoughts into different buckets. In our world, anything kind of, I'd say 1980s and older, just because of the functional obsolescence and age and sort of where it is in its life cycle, we would consider that a C. But you can also see stuff that's built in the 90s that might, fall into more of an affordability category that wasn't maybe built as well. So it is a little bit arbitrary, but for the ease, we typically would just divide it into decades. I would call C's anything 80s, call it, 80s and older, B's sort of 90s and 20 to 2010. And then, actually further now, because we're seeing so much wonderful new Class A being built, but we kind of divide it by decade and product type.
And it is the case, I think Mark would agree, that as time goes on, it is not just the age of the product, but generally the quality of the product, which improves over time, right? I mean, we're seeing remarkable product being built today that is remarkable, not just because it's brand new, but because of the design and the quality of the product.
Okay, thank you, Mark and Dan. Dan, I'm still just trying to build the foundation for people to understand the, fundamentals of how this business works. But sure. How about, as a developer of both market rate and tax credit projects, help us understand those dynamics in Salt Lake County right now. What's your biggest challenge? How does the market rate tax credit projects, how do they come together?
Natalie, on either side of the spectrum, tax credit and or market rate, when we talk about tax credit, we're referring to income restricted apartment units targeted at households at 60%, sometimes 50, sometimes even as low as 40%, and even lower. We have some product as low as 25% of AMI. AMI being area median income, of course. But on either side of that spectrum, costs and direct construction costs are probably the biggest challenge that we face. We have, well, I won't presume to inform this group because I think everybody's pretty well aware what's happened to lumber costs, for example, just as one indicator in the market, and putting together a development pro forma that works based on today's costs is quite dependent upon today's relatively low interest rates and today's exceptionally low cap rates. It is perhaps more than anything, it is the exceptionally low cap rates that makes that possible, because in the current sense, in the immediate sense, maybe these deals don't quite meet underwriting thresholds that investors are looking for, but everybody's looking at those cap rates and sees extraordinary upside in a development. There is, and we've already talked about it just a bit, there is this mismatch. If you look at the distribution of household incomes, whether that's across the market or in just the rental sector, it's going to have something of a familiar bell curve. The shape is going to be somewhat familiar to us. But if you look at the product that's being delivered, the curve gets distorted and shifted way to the right, and it almost becomes wedge shaped. And we're building, as Mark very astutely said, you can't build Class C product. We're building at that high end, and there is this mismatch between the product that's being delivered and where the demand is, demand based on affordability. But that affordability is what's getting sort of trampled in that, and I don't mean to be over dramatic about it, but it's what's eroding in that equation.
Yeah, Mark, I'd love to hear you comment on that, and you as well, Jim. I mean, that's economists never like to hear the term mismatch, right? Between supply and demand. It's Mark, your quick comment on that, and then Jim, I'd love to hear you comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think Clark Ivory has always told the market that affordability isn't a demand issue, particularly in Utah, it's a supply issue. I think what ended up happening is because we didn't start building, until probably really 2014, 15, 16, we reacted pretty slowly, to the dip in 2010 and 2011, not on purpose. That's just sort of what happened in the market. But we've just seen such explosive growth that, as Dan and I have discussed, you really, you have to build to costs in the market, and you have to build to the tenants that are moving to the market. And we haven't really touched base yet on sort of what COVID did to the market and who we brought into the market. A lot of the newer product is being absorbed from people from out of state. We track turnover, and Dan will too, internally, across all the properties that we work on. And we used to see turnover, anywhere from maybe 30 to 40%. In most of our deals, we've seen it well over 50%. And what that means is that somebody doesn't want to go from $1,000 to $1,400. And so, they essentially move out, and then somebody moves in, whether that's somebody from California or elsewhere. And so we're really seeing, what we call a loss to lease, which is driving, the values that we'll talk about in a bit. But there's a lot of interesting dynamics happening in the market for sure.
Yeah, hence the study. Jim, so we're covering a lot of ground here, but the case is really being made that we have a mismatch. We have a very intriguing, challenging market, even as it's a successful market. Give us a little bit more of your commentary, and then I want to go back to Mark about this out-of-state buyer phenomenon. And Jim, somehow, yeah, there we go.
There you go. Sorry. Yeah, the mismatch, supply and demand. Also, a great phrase from a study at the Brookings Institute was that affordable housing is really an income problem. housing affordability is a policy problem. And I think there's some truth to that. Supply is really important. And we've talked about that, what's coming on, but the high price of that supply. And we don't very often talk about the other side, that is the income side. And we have in Utah about 50,000 units are subsidized in one way or another, of 300,000 rental units that we have statewide. And those subsidies are really on the income side. They allow some assistance for low income and moderate income households. And the tax credit program is by far the biggest participant in those assistance, almost 30,000 units. And without Utah Housing Corporation and the tax credit program, our affordability situation would be very dire. Right now in Salt Lake County, we have about 3,000 tax credit unit. Well, a little bit more than that. Probably 3,500 tax credit units under construction or have been approved. I think some of those might be, Dan might have a project or two in there. We've had really a shift in the tax credit program to what's called the 4% program, where we get larger projects, projects over 100 units, projects up to 250, 300 units. And we have several of those underway now. My concern there is they're very heavy in studio and one bedroom. I think we need some more, a little bit better, more balanced unit mix. But on the affordability side, Natalie, I think, it's important to realize, we've got income, and we have 50,000 units that are being subsidized or assisted. And it's really important, but we need more product in that arena. But there are constraints and in terms of the program and the funding.
Mm-hmm. Mark, give us a sense of the out-of-state buyers that are coming into this market.
Oh man, how do I start? The last deal that we just took to market, we had over 400 inquiries. We ended up getting 29 offers. And that's for call it $125 million deal. So that, we basically represented over $3 billion of investment money that wanted to come here with only, one of those buyers getting that deal. So I would definitely say that the investor interest is unprecedented. And that's for obviously all the economic and demographic reasons, that you guys report on and we understand in Utah and we're grateful for. But it's also because of liquidity. One thing that's definitely changed in our market is when early in my career, we didn't see as much out-of-state investors, a lot of California investors. But now we're seeing all over the country, we're seeing international investors, we're seeing international buyers using international capital to buy in Utah. Just as an example, like when, probably 10 years ago, I think we had our record year and we did $500 million in investment sales for multifamily. In 2020, we did 1.7 billion. In 2021, we did just under $2.3 billion. So now people can come here, they can invest here, but they also know that there's liquidity to get out, and that has increased the interest of the buyer pool. So unprecedented buyer interest in the Utah market.
Fascinating. Dan, you've got a really interesting project that I've been watching. I drive by it when I head into work. It's the Liberty Sky project on State Street. I believe it's the first truly high-rise luxury apartment project in Utah. I remember I used to go to San Diego and look around and think, wow, is this ever going to happen in my hometown? And it's happened. But can you comment a little bit on the project, a little bit of background and what you see happening in the high-rise luxury market?
Sure. Natalie, thanks. On one hand, it's correct to think of Liberty Sky as part of the natural evolution of the downtown residential market. As we were contemplating the development of Liberty Sky, we spent a lot of time looking at markets like Denver and Kansas City that were just a little ahead of us, maybe 10 years ahead of us in that evolution. But while at the same time, it is almost predictable that something like Liberty Sky would get built, I have to tell you, it wasn't that we just stumbled into this wonderful opportunity and it just fell into our laps. It's an extraordinary amount of work to figure out how to build that building in a way that creates some, this is affordability with a small a, the right level of affordability vis-a-vis the income distribution in Salt Lake City. What probably the tipping point or the factor that tipped the scale is something a little bit what Mark was talking about, not necessarily just in terms of buyers, but out-of-state renters coming to the market who have an expectation about downtown high-rise living. That's the markets they've come from. That's what they expect. And the rents that they encounter in Salt Lake feel affordable to them. They feel they're comfortable with those rents. And it is that the surge of that, it driven by obviously job growth. Job growth is the key indicator for our demand, for demand of our product. But that job growth and the amount of that job growth that was being that included buyers coming from other markets where they had been exposed to that product is a big factor.
So I want to encourage everyone to put in their questions, and we have a lot have come in. And Nick, I'm seeing these, and so I'm happy to share a couple of them. So go ahead and submit your questions in the chat. Also in the chat box for all of our viewers, there's a link to the report from the Gardner Institute that we're releasing today. Jim, I think this would be a good question for you. What percentage of the approved units are considered affordable or moderate income in Salt Lake County?
Only the tech, I would say right now of the units that we have under construction in Salt Lake County, something like 9,000, 10,000. The tax credit projects that are under construction, and that's roughly around 3,000, but that's a record level of tax credit projects that have been, some of those aren't under construction, they've been approved though. So it's certainly, you know, in terms of when you say affordable to whom? And if we're looking at, you know, those households at 80% of the area median income, which in Salt Lake County, for a family of four, that's going to be around $50,000 in income. Most of, certainly in the downtown market, there's very little, unless it's an assisted project, that's going to be affordable to even the median income renter. So downtown rents are about 30 to 40% higher than they are out in the suburban area. So some of the suburban projects, they would be affordable to households that are at 80% AMI and maybe even a little less, and particularly households, you know, where they have two incomes. Mm-hmm. So it's, I would say it's less than half, which isn't great. And that's mainly because of the distribution of projects that are under construction, the heavy concentration in Salt Lake City and downtown, where prices are, for some studio units, it's over $3 a square foot. And that's, many 2-bedroom units, you get 1,000 square foot 2-bedroom unit, and it's $250, I think, Mark. And we're talking, $2,200, $2,300, $2,400, and that's the base rent. That doesn't include media package, et cetera, parking and so on. So the concentration in Salt Lake County of projects in high rent areas leaves that under construction units really, most of them are not affordable for median income renter.
Dan, is it true that as you build units that are higher end, that there's an absolute relationship as people live in the higher price, therefore freeing up other opportunities in the market that could be more affordable? Is there a relationship between when you're building high end, what it does at the moderate and lower end?
Yes. But it's more complex than that. As someone moves out of product built in the 90s to move into product built in the 2020s, in theory, they leave behind a more affordable unit. So yes, absolutely. So construction at the high end does have that impact. However, it is tempered by just the absolute capacity of households to afford those, not just the high end units, but even that B product built in the 90s is still unaffordable to many households, right? I mean, so it's not just a simple, somebody moves up and the next person in line gets their turn at that affordable unit, because even that B product may not be affordable to them.
Yeah, fair enough. Mark, we have a question. Someone's asked, do we have a sense of how Salt Lake County compares to other urban core areas in the region, making the point that Salt Lake County is somewhat unique geographically in the sense that there's little room to build out and only to build up? And are other urban areas comparable, doing the same, or is there more of a focus on single family homes and suburban development outside of Salt Lake County?
I mean, I don't know quite where to take that, other than to say we obviously track Las Vegas, we track Boise, Idaho, we track Denver, Colorado, Tucson, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Albuquerque. I mean, we would call them sister markets that are similar to us, and you absolutely see similar things happening there. The trends of infill townhomes taking place of, a couple of large homes has happened in most markets. We've definitely seen some higher end design and really cool urban development pretty much in every single city. As it relates to where do we fit, I think Salt Lake City downtown is going to be a completely different downtown. When I lived there in the early 2000s at the Broadway Towers on 2nd East and Broadway, that was like the tallest building, and it was, I think it's 12 stories. I lived on the 10th floor, and that was kind of that or American Towers were like the two places you live downtown. Then we have the church build their high-end condos and their apartments at City Creek. And I don't know, we've just seen this growth that's been incredible. Where we stack next to like a Denver, we have so much room to go. You mentioned San Diego earlier. We have so much room to go. And to Dan's point, people are moving here with a higher expectation. And we're, a lot of the stuff that's getting built is really to meet that expectation of a renter coming into the Utah market. So I would, interestingly, if you wanted to go through design and what had been built, I really think we took a turn like in 2018 and 19, and we're going to start seeing more just incredible products. So I'm not sure that really answers the question, but the answer is yes. We are unique in the fact that we are probably, in the top 40 most dense cities in the US. People recognize that we have to go up. I think that's been recognized too. In the downtown land sales and Sugar House land sales, that where people want to be if they want walkability and lifestyle and entertainment and the whole live, work, play thing, you're going to see that continued growth. But we do have some unique things happening because we're constrained, and we can talk about that too, if we're interested.
Very good. I was on I-15 the other day, driving home from, I'll say, northern Utah, and I looked over the landscape and I thought, good heavens, that sugar house I'm seeing. Salt Laker, and I just, it didn't occur to me that sugar house has just popped out of the ground, and now you can actually see it as quite the activity center. I felt it when I was in sugar house, but I've never thought of it from afar. Dan, we have a question. What needs to change on a policy level to create more affordable housing in Salt Lake County? What do we need to see from policymakers?
Well, that's a broad question, eh, Natalie?
It is, and it's coming from the media, so you'll be quoted.
Well, one of the reasons that we see, and this is just one, it is not the dominant reason, but one of the reasons we see as much development downtown as we do is that there's been a decision to welcome residential development. And the barriers to entry are different in downtown Salt Lake, in Salt Lake City generally, than they might be in some other communities. The barriers to entry in some of our suburban communities are still, it's still unfriendly for density. That doesn't mean I'm an advocate for unconstrained growth and development that isn't thoughtful. There's a time and a place for density. That in every community we have to be thoughtful about how and where we create density, but that's a part of the equation. Unfortunately, I don't see that there is, however, a policy move that is going to make the difference in housing affordability. There are policy moves that are incremental, that will be helpful in moving in that direction. But it's my opinion that at the end of the day, housing affordability, or specifically affordable housing, because there is a distinction between the two, as Jim noted earlier, affordable housing is a matter of resources and commitment of resources to create that affordability for households for whom the market simply doesn't provide any options. That's what we're talking about when we talk about tax credit development. Now, that tier between tax credit development, that 60% of AMI and 80 or 100% of AMI is an entirely different question. And that's the tier in which the policy that we're talking about probably has the biggest, or has the potential for the biggest impact.
Yeah. Jim, I just know you well enough to know that you'd want to comment on what we saw in the 2022 general legislative session, what state leaders are focused on as policymakers to be helpful here. Do you mind giving a quick summary?
Sure. Well, just a little background leading up to that. I've followed the affordable housing issue for a number of years, and the advocates who have beat that drum for 30 years, and they were really the only voice, really, and sometimes in the wilderness, about affordability and the need for affordable housing. And but in the last 4 years, we've seen something, I think, a convergence of several different groups. One is the chamber and the business community, realizing the importance of affordability and economic growth. They have what's called the Housing Gap Coalition, which does work with the legislature, and that was formed 3 or 4 years ago. At about the same time, the legislature got involved, prompted by the homeless situation, and that brought the legislature really into the housing arena and the issues of affordability and those that are on the edge of homelessness. And then we've had the philanthropic community. They have become engaged with the Millers and the Ivory Foundation and the IHC and Zions. All have gotten involved. So it's really a unique time. I think we see a marshaling of efforts across a broad group of participants, which is really encouraging. The legislature over the last 3 or 4 years has passed some legislation, and like Dan said, it's incremental, but it's a first step. And 2 or 3 years ago, we made some, they made some policy changes in terms of how cities are to report their housing needs assessment, and to include certain programs, at least 3 or 4 out of a list of 23 or 4 different programs to encourage affordable housing. Communities were encouraged to adopt 3 or 4 of those, and there was a bit of a carrot for that for communities, so that helped. COVID unfortunately led to some a reduction in some appropriations in 2020 for the 2021 fiscal year, and but really important in the 2020 was the initiation of the Utah Housing Preservation Fund, which have brought the philanthropic community in, along with the legislature matching funds there, and they're doing a terrific job in maintaining and trying and identifying naturally occurring affordable projects that they can preserve. And there's a lot of advantages on the preservation front. You don't have to fight the NIMBYism. You're preserving that investment, and oftentimes that investment was at taxpayer expense because it was a subsidized project. So that brings us to what you asked.
No, but that's great background, Jim. And what'd you see in 2022?
Well, what we had in 2022, was a legislature with a lot of money, almost $1 billion of ARPA dollars to spend. And one of the things they could spend based on Treasury regulations was on affordable housing. We had, was proposed $128 million for homeless programs, and $100 million for what's called gap financing and rural housing affordability projects. And the legislature did not fund that second piece of legislation for the rural and the gap financing. However, on the homeless, they went from 128 million, they cut it back to 55 million. But still, what was so important about that, it's the first time the legislature or any policy has targeted the most vulnerable, those most in need, and that's renters at 30% of area median income, and $55 million. Part of it's a grant program, and I'm not sure the full details on it, but the fact that it targeted that group, which in Salt Lake County alone, we've got about 20,000 renter households who are at 30% or less AMI and face a severe housing cost burden. These people face a housing crisis every day. The fact that we targeted for them is really, that's a pioneer project for Utah. And it was, I think, kudos to the legislature on that piece of legislation.
Thanks, Jim. Mark, I got a question here about rising interest rates. How will they impact development? How high will rates need to go in order to dampen development and investment demand in the county?
I mean, that's a fantastic question and a great bullet point to to bring up. I mean, we've had the threats of rising interest rates since I was born in 1980. I feel like it's been the discussion every single year in my brokerage career. This is probably the most important period of time because we will see it. They've announced it's coming. We've already seen some increases. Every time interest rates increase, obviously the cash flow on permanent financing goes down. And so I do think we're going to see pressure with rising construction costs and interest rates on a lot of these development projects that are being built. I think we're going to see some of them not get constructed. I think the most vulnerable, not to make things worse, but the most vulnerable are the affordable housing units, because if you're going to build a $250,000 to $300,000 unit to rent for 80% AMI, when you could build that same unit and rent it for market, you're gonna convert that to market. So my fear is we're gonna start seeing some of these affordable projects that have a lot of time and energy and money invested in them go to market. But it will affect a lot of projects. It'll affect acquisitions. I would anticipate by Q3 and Q4, if you don't have matching, rise in incomes and rise in rental rates, we're going to start seeing the peak of our pricing here because of that.
Mark, this is Dan. Is it a reasonable anticipation that as interest rates rise, and they will begin to rise across the spectrum of where interest rates get applied, not just in mortgage rates, and you see investment alternatives becoming more and more attractive, that we'll see decompression in the cap rates, and that some of the liquidity that is some of the liquidity that exists in the market today at levels that you already noted were so high, some of that liquidity will begin to flow elsewhere?
Yeah, I think we've all seen it, right? I mean, capital chases yield, and it's a risk profile analysis, risk and return. And right now, Salt Lake City gives you very little downside, but certainly offers upside through rental increases over time. As interest rates go up and as yields get compressed, that capital is going to look for alternative sources, no question. That's also why we're seeing such a flood into development, as Dan can note. Is there appears to be more yield in development than there is in buying existing assets, with how late we are in the cycle and how expensive things have gotten. And so, yeah, I think with rising interest rates, we will see, capital move away.
Thank you, Mark and Dan. I asked Nick to pull up the forecast for the Salt Lake County apartment market in 2024. I'll just note to our viewers that our study focused specifically on Salt Lake County. So we did not do this for Davis, Weber, Utah, some of the other metro counties. Happy to provide commentary, post program on that. But Jim, do you mind just walking through this forecast and what it means? And then we'll close out the program by asking Mark and Dan to give us a sense of where they think we are in terms of potentially overbuilding in the market.
Yes, thank you, Natalie. Given historic growth rates, and by over the last 10 years in renter-occupied units, have projected by 2024 about 166,000 renter units in Salt Lake County, and the households will grow by about 12,000, a little over 12,000 units or households. So we're going to get likely, and again, I just want to put a qualifier in there. It's projecting the growth rate of renter households is really difficult in a period like this, where we've had so much increase in on ownership, but then also you have what Mark has talked about and Dan mentioned, renters moving into the market, and how do we capture that in the projection? And that's tough. But anyway, it's very likely, I think, over the next 3 years, given how much product we have under construction, and it's going to reach the market. We've got countywide 12,000 units under construction, and they're going to reach the market over the next 2 or 3 years. And I think that will probably exceed a renter household. So the vacant units are going to go from where we are now, 3,000 units to over 9,000, which will push the vacancy rate up to almost 6%. And again, you know, it's we're going 3 years out, and we've got interest rates, and as Mark was talking about, and what that means for development on Dan's side. You know, it's a little bit different ball game than we had 6 weeks ago. And inflation, of course, is a huge concern. But I think that what we'll see is some relief over the next 3 years for the renter. It will still be a landlord's market, but we're going to see a little bit, I think, tempering of rental rate increases. And I'd like to hear what Dan has to say about that. I would think that in 2022, we're still going to get double digits in rental increases. I think in 2023, it'll probably moderate a bit. Maybe by 2024, we'll be down to the historic average over the last 10 years of about 5.5% increase annually. So a little bit relief for the renter, I hope, and a moderation over time of rental rate increases.
Thanks, Jim. All right, Mark and Dan, let's finish it off. Last question for the two of you. I'll ask you the same question. Mark, we'll go to you first and then conclude with Dan. I just am hopeful on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being worried about overbuilding. How do you rate the market in 2024? So 5 is, you know, the most intense worrying about overbuilding, and 1 would be not worried. Where do you stand there, Mark? And any commentary with that?
Yeah, I'm excited to hear Dan, because I would say I'm a 2. I mean, I think one thing that I can say is that I don't think we're going to see those types of vacancies in the majority of our stock. We might see those in our newer stock. You know, like there's certain areas of the market I have some concern in. One of them is North Temple. It's a point system. You have by right ability to go build apartments there. You'll see a lot of apartments in certain areas get constructed. So I think there's going to be pockets of heartache, as Jeff Neese would call it. But I think for the most part, I'm really bullish on the market. I mean, I love the joke that Gavin Newsom has sold more homes and rented more apartments in Utah than any other broker. And I think what's happening on the West Coast is going to continue to drive value to our market. We're just a great place to be. So I'm extremely bullish. I think that developers like Dan are the smartest guys I know. There's a reason why I'm not a developer. I think they're smart about how they deliver, when they deliver, what they deliver. And I certainly expect some of these projects to pivot, to change as needed, and deliver the product that our market needs to remain healthy. So I'm very bullish and grateful for our leadership, and grateful for you, Natalie, and all that you do, and certainly for Jim and his research. I think if Jim showed all the research that goes into his projections, people would not believe it. So there's definitely a ton of value in his effort, and we appreciate that. So I think he's right on the money. I think there are a lot of variables in play, but I know what went into that number. So thank you, Jim.
Yeah, including his site visits to 41 projects this weekend. Dan, you get the last word on the question of 1 to 5 being most worried about overbuilding, and 5 being most worried, 1 being least worried. Where are you at for 2024? And any final commentary?
So Natalie, I would just share, the only reason I grew this white beard was so I could be a little bit more like Jim Wood. He is clearly, well, we just have such extraordinary respect and admiration for his work. And as I look at this projection and I say 5.7% vacancy, really, that's the bad news? You know, that's as bad as it's going to get. My point of reference is the cycles in the 80s and the 90s. I'm not blaming anyone, but to help put it in context, the Jimmy Carter era, when we had vacancy rates in the high teens, I've been through those cycles. And so overbuilding brings back to me those sort of those sort of fears. So maybe I'm just a little bit chicken little here, because on your 1 to 5, I'm probably a 3 on my way to 4. The 5.7, if that sets the floor, right? If 94% occupancy is now my floor, okay, maybe I'm not quite as anxious as I would have been, but there are so many variables at work. I find myself, well, we talk about overbuilding in our office every day. It's the first question we address when we're talking about a new project. And as Mark noted, when he talked about North Temple as almost a separate segment of the market, the market in Salt Lake today is far more segmented than it used to be. And that allows you, or demands that you think about overbuilding sort of segment by segment. So it isn't a global universal anxiety about overbuilding that I have nearly so much as it is some segments of the market becoming overbuilt. And that gets right back to that, what I talked about earlier, that mismatch between the shape of income distribution and where we're actually building. So at that very high end, you know, there's an awful lot, there's an awful lot of product under development, and I think there's reason for us all to be a little bit apprehensive about that.
Dan Lofgren, Mark Jensen, thanks so much for your time this morning. Really appreciate your commentary. And I just want to personally thank Jim Wood for his leadership, for his fabulous research. Thanks, Jim, for bringing this research to us. Our next Newsmaker will be Tuesday, April 19th, 8:30 in the morning. We're going to talk about climate change with a robust discussion about carbon dividends and other possible climate solutions. So stay tuned for further details. If you have questions, comments, or feedback, please write us at Gardner Institute at eccles.utah.edu. Thanks so much, everybody, and a big thanks to the Gardner team for putting on this Newsmaker. Thank you, Nick, for all you've done. Take care, everyone.